And earlier, I spoke with a nationally known law professor to get a sense of the strength of the charges against Trump, whether the case will be dismissed, and if Trump will serve jail time. Take a look. Joining me is John Bansab, nationally known law professor of public interest at George Washington University. Now, on everybody's mind is, what is Trump's legal team going to do next? He's been charged with 34 counts. He pleaded not guilty. Maybe enlighten us a little bit.
Almost certainly his team will file a motion or several motions seeking to get the indictment quashed. He can argue that legally it doesn't fly because it's trying to bring in a federal crime on a state charge. They can talk about prosecutorial misconduct, selective prosecution, and perhaps one or two other things, hoping to get the indictment thrown out.
Now, let me ask you in detail. You mentioned faulty legal theory. Can you expand on that? Let our viewers know what that is.
Yes, the primary charge is that there was a falsification of records. That is a misdemeanor, and the statute of limitations has run on that. So in order to get around the statute of limitations problem, the prosecutor has said it's a felony because they made the record change in order to commit a federal crime which is influencing the election. Ordinarily, record-keeping cases are not even brought as crimes, they are handled civilly, but this idea of bootstrapping, of using a state case to try a federal violation is something which has never been tried before, and many people just think it will not work.
Is there a possibility that perhaps Bragg's team, Alvin Bragg, would have smoking gun evidence to prove that Trump had the intent to cover up another crime?
We don't know if he may have some other evidence, but the question is not whether or not, the question is not a matter of proof. The issue is, can a state prosecutor bring a charge, an indictment, which depends upon a violation of a federal crime, particularly since the federal government has never brought a charge against him for that kind of crime.
I see, okay. Now, what do you think Alvin Bragg's strategy will look like going forward?
Well, Alvin Bragg is going to try to defend each of those motions, and I think he may have some problems. On selective prosecution, I've seen more than a dozen people ask the question, would anybody other than Trump have been indicted on this ground? And the answer to that is no. That's what we call selective prosecution. The charge itself, as I said, is somewhat weak, and I think the motion has a reasonable chance of success.
Why do you say that? What are the chances that the motion will be successful or not successful?
Well, again, looking at several motions, or one motion which includes various different arguments, I would say his chances of getting a dismissal are certainly less than 50%, but certainly not insignificant. It will be something to worry about, and Bragg is going to have to do some good lawyering to get over that charge. One of the problems with this case is that we're dealing with something which is where there's no precedent. Lawyers, law professors, prosecutors, defendants, and judges all rely on precedent. There is no precedent here, so it's hard to make any kind of predictions. Also, we know that, at least in the past, there's a phenomenon called Trump law. What that meant is that years ago, when Trump first got into office, some judges were so upset by what he was doing and his treatment of other judges that they applied Trump law. That is, that they would bend and twist and turn standard legal doctrines to try one way or another to get to Trump, whether or not they would have done so otherwise for anybody else. So you can't discount the idea there might be Trump law working that way, or there might be Trump law working the other way, that people who really believe in Trump might want to bend the law to help him.
So on that point that you're saying now, do you think Trump will get a fair trial?
I would think he would get a fair trial. The idea that they want to move the venue doesn't make much sense to me. You get a change of venue usually when you had a particularly heinous crime occurring in some small area where it didn't get very much publicity. So when the trial occurs, you move the trial to another town 100 miles away where it didn't get as much publicity. But here you don't have a heinous crime. I don't think anybody, even those who are most against Trump, think that paying off one or two women is a heinous crime. And he wants to move the trial allegedly to Westchester. Well, they get the same newspapers and the same news and everything in Westchester as they do in downtown Manhattan.
Now, Trump was indicted on Tuesday this week, but before that, there was a leak, actually. I don't know if you're aware of it. If you are, what are your thoughts on it?
Yes, last Tuesday, Trump did predict that he would be arrested, but he later said that was based simply upon his readings of various newspaper clippings and television and so on. It turned out not to be accurate. Why Trump did it, I'll leave to others.
Now, let me have you take a guess on this. What are the chances that he'll be convicted and will actually serve jail time?
Well, that's very hard to say what his chances are at trial because, again, we've seen the indictment, but the indictment is silent, completely silent, doesn't mention the other federal crime. So we don't even know completely what he's being charged with. Again, because this has never happened before, I don't think we can predict. We know that on both sides there are very, very strong feelings, and all he needs is one person on that jury who's a strong Trump supporter to say, I'm not going to vote, I'm going to vote no. And that, by the way, is a constitutional right. Every juror has a right to what we call juror nullification. No matter how clear the facts, no matter how clear the law, he can vote no for any reason at all, but primarily if he thinks the prosecutor has not played fairly, if it's not fair, if it's not just, and so on. And anybody who has that, who comes in with the mind to vote for Trump is probably not going to mention that on the voir dire. But in addition, there may be people who don't particularly favor Trump. But once they look at the evidence, these many, many, many charges, what is clearly overcharging, they may say, well, I'm just going to vote no. Because overcharging is a real problem. In this case, a little bit like the one I use for my students for hypothetical. Guy is charged with robbing a bank. So they charge him with bank robbery. They also throw in threatening teller A, threatening teller B, spitting on the sidewalk and having his getaway car parked in a no parking zone. That's crazy. That's what we have here.
Yeah, it is interesting that he's charged on 34 counts of basically variations of the same things. Yeah, you make a good point there. But let me have you take one more guess. If by your best estimate, how long do you think this whole thing will be dragged out to?
Trump, of course, has a long history of dragging out all kind of proceedings against himself, and he will try very hard to do so here. Unfortunately, in the past, he hasn't had very good lawyers, so it's not clear whether the ones he has now will do any better. But we know Trump is going to delay this as much as possible, and everybody knows that they want to try to wind it up before a certain date, which is the date when the elections are coming up. So I don't know how long it will be. Some people are predicting that we won't have a definitive verdict until after the elections. We don't know. But by the way, whether he's convicted or not, whether he's indicted in these other places or not, he can run for president. By the way, he can even run for president once he's in a jail cell. And interestingly enough, if he does get to be president, apparently he can then pardon himself for any federal crimes. The issue of whether a president can pardon himself came up during the Trump presidency, because at that time there was also talk about bringing him up on various federal charges. And although lawyers are far from unanimous on it, I think the majority opinion is there is nothing in the Constitution which would have stopped Trump from pardoning himself, all of his family members, any associates, and so on. Now, of course, things are a little bit different, but somebody has characterized this as a question of who will get into office so that they can pardon themselves. Because after all, Biden is the president, but he also is found to have concealed documents in both his garage and his office. So technically, he might be prosecuted. And then we would have a question: if Trump gets elected president, he could pardon himself. If Biden gets elected president, he could pardon himself. This is Alice in Wonderland. Never before, never again.
That's very funny. I wonder if the Secret Service is going to be thrown in jail with him. What do you think?
Yes, if Trump goes to prison, it's going to be a real problem for the Secret Service. And I imagine what they would do is keep Trump in an isolated place. And although some of the guarding would be done by the ordinary prison guards, they would have some marshals who would be deputized as temporary prison guards who would make sure about his safety. We have had in the past a number of instances where people in prison, high-powered people, have hanged themselves or otherwise allegedly caused their own death, and it has often been under suspicious circumstances. So I think, yes, there would be a real problem. Trump is entitled to Secret Service protection as a former president, and they'd have a hell of a problem. But again, we're all in completely uncharted waters, so my guess, based upon zero precedents, is no better than yours.
Well, thank you so much for taking my questions today, Professor. It was such a pleasure talking to you.